If you've been watching the news in recent years, chances are you've seen a queue like this. No, they're not waiting to get their hands on the latest batch of PS5s, they're waiting to get their hands on this. That's 3 days' worth of groceries for one family, because these people are at a food bank. In the 6th richest country in the world, these people can't afford to feed themselves, so they'll get 3 days' worth of food for each member of their family, and pray that they don't get turned away for using the food bank too often, because yes, that's a thing. Part 1, The Rise of Food Banks. In 2010, the Trussel Trust, Britain's leading food bank charity, distributed just under 41,000 food parcels. If that wasn't bad enough, by 2021 that number had risen to 2.5 million, a 6,098% increase in just 11 years. You're probably familiar with this next part of the story, so I'll keep it brief. Starting in 2010, the government declared war on the poor by putting austerity measures in place. Completely ignoring the history of how economics actually works, David Cameron and George Osborne told us that Britain's finances were in trouble, and that we needed to cut spending on public services in order to stay solvent. They also said that Labour's reckless spending on ordinary people was to blame for our debts, not bailing out the banks after the 2008 financial crash. Kind of a convenient narrative for a party that likes to shrink public services, don't you think? Of course, the fiercely independent and truth-seeking journalists at our biggest newspapers, and at the BBC, all called the Tories out on their blatant lies. What's that? They actually repeated the lies endlessly until a good chunk of the public believed them. Well, I never. The results of the government cutting the services that people relied on to survive were predictable. If you were around back then, you probably noticed that the number of homeless people you saw increased tenfold within the space of a year. At the same time, the use of food banks exploded. And, since David Cameron left office, food bank use has continued to rise under his successors. Because, despite what they say, austerity never really went away. Part 2, The Problem with Food Banks. In January 2022, 1 million adults in the UK went at least one entire day without food. That's about 1 in 50 people, so it probably includes somebody you know. And those are only the ones who went an entire day without food. We don't know how many people had to skip at least one meal. If an economy systematically produces 1 million people who can't afford to eat properly, it's fair to say that the economy isn't adequately serving the interests of the general population. But while food insecurity has been increasing each year in both the UK and other imperial core countries, like the US and Canada, our governments haven't done anything to fix the underlying causes of the food insecurity. Instead of making changes to ensure that people have livable wages, affordable housing, and an adequate social safety net, our governments have been working to prop up the current system, which funnels ever more wealth to the top, at the expense of ordinary people. One way they've been doing this is by promoting the use of food banks. In the UK, DeFRA has been giving out grants to food charities during the pandemic, like this £16 million grant to FareShare, an organisation that works with 11,000 frontline charities that provide food to the hungry. The government has also been trying to institutionalise the use of food banks by advising local councils to steer people to them for help, instead of simply giving people money to buy food. At the same time that the government cut universal credit by £20 a week, it announced a temporary £500 million fund that councils could use to help households experiencing poverty. In the advice they gave councils alongside the funding, they repeatedly said that councils should direct people to food banks, or else give them vouchers, to ensure that the funds aren't spent on anything other than food. This advice stems from the right-wing narrative that poor people are poor because of moral failings. If only they'd stop being so lazy, they'd earn a good income and start being productive members of society. Conservatives like to pretend that we live in a meritocracy, where all those who work hard are rewarded well, and where being poor obviously means that you didn't work hard enough. 0 hours contracts, low-paid gig work, and extortionate rents mean nothing to these people. If you were smart and hardworking, you wouldn't be stuck in that situation. Obviously then, by that logic, you can't give money directly to hungry people, because those moral degenerates will only spend it on booze and drugs instead of food. Wait a minute, that actually sounds pretty good. Where do I sign up? But, BS arguments about morality aside, relying on food banks isn't a good solution, because they actually leave most people in need to go hungry. Research in Canada shows that only the most desperate 21% of people struggling to feed themselves actually get referred to a food bank. When researchers questioned the other 79% about why they weren't getting help, two clear themes emerged from their answers. Some people said that they either didn't know about food banks or were unable to access them for some reason. But, despite the evidence that they were in food poverty, most people said that they didn't need to use food banks, and would only turn to them as a last resort. This attitude isn't surprising. In Canada, like the UK, the neoliberal era has seen politicians demonize welfare recipients. We've been told endlessly that people who need help are scroungers, and that many of them are frauds, cheating the system to live off the backs of hard-working people. It's been so bad that, when surveyed, British people think that 24% of benefit claims are fraudulent, when actually it's only 0.7%. In this sort of environment, where the media demonizes the poorest, while holding up rags to riches stories as examples of what anyone can achieve, rather than the good luck stories that they really are, is it any wonder that many people are too ashamed to ask for help when they need it? The brutal reality is that people usually choose to skip meals, delay paying their bills, and go into rent arrears before they finally crack and ask for help. But in a society where those born into poorer households are usually funneled into low-paying and precarious work, it isn't a level playing field to begin with, so finding yourself in financial trouble isn't a reflection of your worth as an individual. Besides which, almost everyone experiences a major disaster at some point in their lives. We shouldn't be leaving people to go hungry because they get ill, or because they have to reduce their work hours to care for a loved one. And people shouldn't be shamed into silence when they need our support. That brings us on to the second problem with food banks. It's not just that many people are too ashamed to turn to food banks when they're in trouble, but food banks actively turn away hungry people. The Trussel Trust, for example, will only provide people with 3 three-day food parcels every 6 months. In other words, they'll feed people for a maximum of 9 days out of 182. That's fine if you're having a temporary cash flow problem, but what about the people who are living in chronic hunger? The Trussel Trust's intention might be to help as many people as possible by limiting the amount of food that they give to each person, but that doesn't help the people who have to go hungry on a regular basis. There are many people whose rent outstrips their housing benefits, and who have to make up the difference out of their grocery budget. There are people whose earnings are low and erratic, or whose pension can't cover the cost of living. Food banks aren't designed to help these people. Some food charities will help them, where they exist, but they don't exist everywhere, and they shouldn't have to. In a country where 24 people became billionaires in 2020, nobody should have such low pay and precarious work that they struggle to feed their family. Nobody should be going to food charities, let alone being turned away by them. The fact is that the government keeps cutting provisions for the poor while cutting taxes for the rich, and keeps shifting the cost of providing public services onto working people. But this isn't a problem with the Conservatives. It's a problem with the system. The Tories might be the most openly corrupt, but both major parties are courting big business for donations, and big business doesn't give money away for free. Under capitalism, the purpose of business is to increase profits, and part of business strategy is donating to friendly politicians, in order to keep wages down and working conditions poor. The right to food is recognized in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as part of the right to an adequate standard of living, and is enshrined in the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's time for us to demand that our government fulfills its obligation to us, by ensuring that all working people earn a wage that's adequate to feed their families, and that the social safety net provides a dignified quality of life to those unable to work, rather than fobbing them off on charities. Let me know what you think in the comments, and remember to like, subscribe, and share.